Due to digital technology and the internet, we are now living in a world that is more connected than ever before. While enjoying the convenience and efficiency of innovation, safety in the digital domain has caused increasing concerns. From personal information to a national election, all could be threatened and influenced simply by a computer. So how do we safeguard the security of cyberspace? What is the way to build a mechanism that provides protection to all? And how can nations work together for a better and safer digital world? To discuss these and other issues, I'm very glad to sit down with Mr. Bruce McConnell on the sidelines of the 5th World Internet Conference in Wuzhen, Zhejiang Province. He's the Global Vice President at the East-West Institute. This is Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Welcome to Dialogue, sir. What do you think of the theme of this conference, which is to build mutual trust and collective governance towards a community of shared future? The issue is, are we able to share a future?
We share a future whether we like it or not, don't we? So the question is, do we share a peaceful future in which we're collaborating and cooperating with each other in mutual trust?
We see growing defiance, and that's a consensus across the aisle between Republicans and Democrats. And a skeptical China, which is trying to figure out what the future might hold for the two countries and for those most consequential bilateral relationship. From your perspective, what does that mean?
Well, I think you're right. We are in a period of difficult relationships between our two countries. And this is very unfortunate because these are the two biggest and most important countries in the world in so many ways, culturally, economically, increasingly from a military standpoint. So it's critical that our two countries, the U.S. and China, get along and work together. We have too many problems in the world to be fighting with each other. We need to work together to solve problems like climate change and terrorism and migration and disease. So I think it's a serious time, and people of goodwill must work together to try to improve our relations.
Here is the chronic issue of a security dilemma between the two countries, and therefore mistrust has shaped up and taken root in the heart and mind of politicians on both sides. And therefore, do you think in this rule-based world, China needs to do more to reflect upon what we have done, or do you think it's the rise of populism in the United States and likewise unilateralism that should take the blame?
Well, I think there's a difference between blame and responsibility, right? So I think both parties need to take responsibility for their own actions and need to approach the relationship from a sense of humility and curiosity. Unfortunately, although curiosity is a very American trait, humility not so much. And so I think we have to, both sides have to recognize the cultural characteristics of the other and accept that and figure out ways to work together. So on the American side, like some other Western countries, there is a reversion backwards away from internationalism, globalism, to a nationalistic approach. And that is damaging to overall global stability. So that is part of the problem. We could discuss the reasons for that. They're domestic political reasons. In China, there is this, in my opinion, a kind of schizophrenia, if you will. It has one foot in the world of being a developing country, and on the other hand, it is at the same time another foot into becoming a leading country and standing tall and powerful on the global stage.
Does it mean automatically that China is not ready yet to assume the world leadership, and the United States has overreacted to the fast expansion of our global stakes?
So I think that I would agree that the United States has overreacted to China's rise, and I think that one is never completely ready to assume leadership, but I think it is time for China to increasingly take global responsibility in all its actions.
We are still recovering from the impact of Vice President Mike Pence's policy speech, does it mean the return of the Cold War or return of McCarthy hysteria, which was the result of the Cold War in the wake of the Second World War?
Yes, there are some commentators who believe that McCarthyism lasted for 2 to 4 years, and we may be in for a period like that now, and I think that's possible. However, I think the world is a very different place. There are no longer just 2 major powers. There are many important powers, and we're playing a different game. It's a multilateral, multi-sector game. I mean, companies are very powerful also. So we have to play in the 21st century politics, not in the 20th century.
Let's return to the topic of something you're good at, cybersecurity. You were a senior expert with the Homeland Security Department following the 9/11 terrorist attacks. Let us know your concerns about online security. In the cyberspace, we vow to build a community of shared future. However, we are facing a lot of challenges such as virus, piracy, organized crimes, terrorism, alleged meddling with domestic politics, so on and so forth. You can raise a number of issues that we must be very serious with. Now, what do you think is the most scary threat for both sides?
Well, as we said when I was at Homeland Security, cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. So there are many players who must do things in order to achieve a safe and a stable and secure cyberspace. But I think there are 2 big dangers in cyberspace right now. The first is that, in general, people don't take it very seriously. Individuals don't protect their systems. They're careless with their information. Companies build technology and sell it to the public and to other companies without good security in it. Governments don't invest enough in protecting their systems. So we must take this much more seriously to defend our systems and make sure they are protected. The other problem, of course, comes from the side of the attacks. They come from many places, from amateurs who can get strong attack tools. You can buy strong attack tools on the internet. From criminals who use the technology to steal money from banks or hold other organizations ransom and get the ransom money from them. And then, of course, from governments. And I actually think that at the moment, governments are not playing a very constructive role in securing cyberspace.
One of the issues, I'm afraid, is it's difficult. It used to be difficult to tell differences between a state actor or a non-state cell in organizing and launching unilateral attacks against the state player. With the advancement of the state-of-the-art technology today, do you think it's a lot easier to tell the difference?
Yeah. This is the problem, as we say, of attribution. Who is behind the attack?
Attribution.
Correct, because it's easy to hide behind other countries and make it look like it comes from one place and when it really comes from someplace else. So, for example, when there was an attack on Sony Pictures, the North Koreans who were responsible for that attack, in part of their attack, they captured servers in China and made it appear that some of the attacks were coming from China. China was not happy about this activity, and when the U.S. brought it to their attention, they corrected this problem. But I think today it is getting much easier to tell who is behind attack, but it's not instantaneous. You can't tell immediately. It takes days or even a few weeks to do all the analysis and become confident about who is behind it.
What would prompt the Pentagon to make sure this is a behavior of war? It amounts to declaration of war on the homeland security of the United States.
So I think those are a couple different questions there. I think it is true that cyberspace has become a domain of conflict, and so states are attacking each other. And I think this is part of the problem. So states are attacking each other in cyberspace and staying below the level of warfare, below the level of armed conflict. But this is an area where there are no clear boundaries and no clear rules. So this causes instability and danger of miscalculation. So there is no bright line to say when an attack would become an act of war. But if it involved serious impact on humans, if many humans were killed or injured, or destruction of some kind of physical destruction, that would be certainly different than the kind of attacks we're seeing today, which are attacks on other computers or propaganda attacks, which generally have not been seen as part of armed conflict.
What do you think of the allegation that the smartphone of President Trump may have been bugged, eavesdropped by the Chinese government? The response from the Chinese Foreign Ministry, Madam Hua Chunying, said, you better use Huawei if you don't trust your own iPhone. So what do you think of this joke?
I like this joke for a different reason, which is that the Americans think that American phones are more secure, and the Chinese think that Chinese technology is more secure. But there is no such thing as American phones or Chinese phones. The iPhone, for example, is manufactured with parts from 20 countries. So all the supply for information technology is global, and we can no longer pretend that there is national technology. This is part of the trade problem that we are facing.
After the British government raised concerns about Huawei, the company agreed to build a British cybersecurity testing center where the code for all British Huawei products is poked and prodded by the nation's intelligence agency, GCHQ. So do you think by doing that, it is easier and a big relief for the UK government to accept more of the Huawei products in the British market as a result?
I think that is a very interesting case, because you are absolutely right. The British government thoroughly tested for 2 years all of Huawei's products that it were going into the, these are not little phones, these are big switches that go into the core infrastructure that switch phone calls all over England. But they did not find any problems, and where they found problems, Huawei made corrections to address those. I think that was a very constructive approach, and other countries, including China and the US, should take that kind of approach when looking at each other's technologies, not just banning them because they are from some other country.
Are you suggesting that the backdoor allegation is still there, or it will be closed as a result of the inspection by the British authorities?
I was not on the inside, so I don't know what they found, but clearly the British authorities were able to satisfy their concerns about the risk to a level that they felt everything was fine for using this technology in their country.
So let me confirm, your suggestion is that the U.S. could consider a similar model?
I think the U.S. could do that, and I think China could do that for some U.S. technologies also.
To seek mutual security assurance. Now, in an effort to urge the Homeland Security Department to reverse its Kaspersky ban, the Russian antivirus company similarly offered to open up its source code for review.
The Russian cybersecurity company Kaspersky next week actually will open a center in Zurich where it will open its code for inspection and do several other things to attempt to build confidence in its products for Europe and eventually for the United States. I think this is very constructive, and from the standpoint of globally, this is the first security company who has offered to have this kind of transparency. That's different from IT companies generally, because Microsoft has always had a transparency center similar to the kinds of things that Huawei did. But this is the first time a security company is exposing itself to independent review. I think it's quite interesting.
Thank you so much. You are watching Dialogue with Mr. Bruce McConnell, Vice President of the East-West Institute. He used to work for the Homeland Security Department and is a senior expert of fighting cyber terrorism. Stay with us. We'll be right back. Calling 911 all American individuals were required to cooperate with the Homeland Security and other agencies?
I think Americans do not trust government very much.
What do you think of the revelations by Edward Snowden?
Obviously, what Snowden did was a criminal action.
Allies of the United States were wondering aloud why they had been spied on.
We are still allies. We have to work together.
Welcome back, sir. Looking back in your hindsight wisdom, what do you think of the revelations by Edward Snowden in terms of cybersecurity?
Well, I must say that when I was at the Department of Homeland Security, I was in many conversations, official conversations with the Chinese government about cybersecurity, and there was a big change in those conversations, in the tone of those conversations after the Snowden revelations, because the Americans had always taken the position that you guys are spying on us, but we don't spy on you. And then the public information came out, and it changed the dynamic very much. So while obviously what Snowden did was a criminal action, and he should be prosecuted for that, in some ways I think it leveled the playing field in terms of candor and honesty in conversations.
Now, Bruce, following the event of Edward Snowden, allies of the United States were wondering aloud why they had been spied on. Now, there were two different kinds of responses in the wake of Edward Snowden. One was from the internal world of expertise. I mean, the real experts said, hey, come on, no big deal, everybody does this. Public anger could not be brushed aside easily because they had the rights to show their sense of frustrations towards their ally, the United States. Now, what's your take on the two different kinds of responses?
Well, I think you've characterized it completely right. There was a political response in the public, and there was the realpolitik response of we are still allies, we have to work together. So I think that's exactly what happened, and eventually I think some of the transatlantic relationship has been repaired, but other things have happened since then. So it was definitely a bad day for the transatlantic partnership.
Prior to the administration of Donald Trump, the U.S. and China had conducted several rounds of a strategic and economic dialogue, and one of the major issues on the agenda between the two sides was cybersecurity, and China was accused and still accused of conducting cyber espionage. Following the revelations of Edward Snowden, do you think both sides should sit down and talk about, look, what needs to be done is more restrictive policy measures to make sure that nothing would spin out of control, right? Do you think this is the way that things should play out?
Yeah, I think that there are two things that need to be done. So one thing that needs to be done is there needs to be good communications between the two countries, so that when one country perceives a cyber threat or a cyber attack, it can talk to its counterparts and say, what is going on with this? Right now there is no a good channel for communications, and so there's misunderstanding, and that's very dangerous. The other thing is that we have to have some rules about what is acceptable behavior by governments, and we don't have any rules of the road. We have, in conventional warfare, we have bans on chemical weapons, for example. That doesn't mean that everyone always follows the rules, but if there are no rules, there's nothing you don't get anyone to follow anything. So that's where we are in cyberspace. So states have to get together and agree about what actions are okay and what actions are unacceptable.
It's pretty sad, isn't it, that the historic agreement on eliminating all the short and medium-range nuclear missiles, it's abolished by the Trump administration. And however, the inking of this agreement indicated the end of the Cold War formulae between Ronald Reagan and his Russian Soviet counterpart, Mikhail Gorbachev. So does that mean the start of Cold War, and when it comes to cybersecurity, something worse could happen?
Yeah, well, I think we are living in an increasingly dangerous time. I agree with that. And some of these activities, like cyber attacks on each other or elimination of treaties, are destabilizing, and so they increase the level of risk.
What does President Trump want? By eliminating all the old agreement or outdated agreements, quote unquote, he wants to set up a new set of rules. Is that what he wants, or do you think it's a purely single-minded pursuit of unilateralism by putting America first, first and foremost, unconditionally?
This reminds me of what we were talking about a minute ago about the difference between the political reaction for domestic political reasons and strategic, if you will, reaction. So I think another possibility is that this is a negotiating tactic. We have seen the president say one thing and then change his mind and do something else, with the ZTE case, for example. So I think it is too soon to tell how the INF will play out, but I think that it's one thing to make deals by bluffing when you're in real estate. It's a different thing when you're a head of state.
So much for our discussion about the state behavior for both sides, the U.S. and China. Let's look at the concerns of individuals in the age of cybersecurity. We all want to protect our own private data. We all want to protect our own privacy. We don't want our secrets to be known or to be made public through the use of the internet. Following 9/11, all American individuals were required to cooperate with the Homeland Security and other agencies of the U.S. government to protect them by exposing their own individual data to the Homeland Security.
I think Americans do not trust government very much. So there were no changes in policy that required people to cooperate, and no changes that required people to share data. So that's a misperception. But I do think that the question of privacy is an interesting one. I think privacy is a 200-year concept. So back when our ancestors were alive, they lived in villages. There was no privacy. There is no privacy in a small village. People know what you're doing, where you're going, who you are talking to, who you are flirting with. There's nothing called privacy. It was only with the rise of cities and large towns that people could become anonymous and have privacy. And this lasted for a period, I don't know, 200-300 years. And I think now with the technology, we are going back to a place where people will know what you're doing. So we will miss those days. But I think there is a difference. In the village, it was your people who knew whether you liked it or not. It was a small group of people. Now, it is very, very large organizations that know all about you. In China, it's the state. In the West, it's companies. But it's the same kind of thing. You don't have any privacy from the surveillance of these large organizations. Traditionally, in industry, you get concentration, right? You have concentration, for example, in the telecommunications industry. You had concentration in the United States, and eventually the government had to come in and break up the big companies because it's anti-competitive. They become monopolies. So I think with some of the big platforms, it's not time yet, but at some point there may need to be some kind of breakup action by the government and increased regulation of these companies. I like to use the analogy of the airline industry. So you fly around, I know, quite a bit. You cannot get on an airplane without proving who you are. Not only that, the air pilot has a license, the plane has been inspected, all the people who are servicing the plane have had background investigations. Cyberspace is much more important in terms of its economic and social and political impact than the airline industry. But we've got none of that. None of that security. Anybody can put a computer up and anybody can sell a computer, and there are no driver's licenses on the internet. So we have a long way to go to mature this industry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ray. It's great to be here.